The year was 1854, and the South was heavy with heat, wealth, and the quiet terror that ran through the veins of its grand estates. The sprawling plantation of the Davenport family lay nestled among endless fields of cotton and tobacco, its white-pillared mansion gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, burning tallow candles, and the faint sour perfume of wealth, perfumed handkerchiefs, oils, and the sharp tang of freshly pressed linen. Here, the world was orderly, structured, and rigid, dictated by rules that had existed for generations. And in that world, the servants moved like shadows, present yet invisible, silent yet essential. Among them was one who carried himself with a quiet dignity that no master could claim to understand. His name, once known to his family and now stripped from him by law and property, was Jonah. To the Davenports he was simply the servant, the man who serves, a piece of furniture with hands and a bowed back, a presence meant to be useful and polite, never defiant. And yet, Jonah had learned the language of survival long before he set foot in the Davenport house. He understood the weight of a smile, the power of silence, and the strength found in patience. On that particular evening, the dining hall was alive with the ritual of wealth. A chandelier of crystal droplets cast shimmering reflections across the polished oak table. Plates of glistening roast meat, golden brown potatoes, and buttered bread were arrayed with meticulous care, each dish a testament to the Davenport family's means and vanity. The ladies of the household, clad in layers of silk and lace, whispered gossip in hushed tones, while the men, clad in stiff coats and starched collars, discussed politics, land, and commerce with the casual arrogance of privilege. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, but inside, the world was the world of the few who could command it and the many who served it. Jonah moved among them like a phantom of courtesy. His hands, strong and scarred from years of labor, trembled not at the work itself, but at the constant observation. Every movement, every glance, every drop of wine poured was measured. His smile never faltered. It was small, polite, almost imperceptible, yet beneath it lay a calculation the family would never perceive. When Mrs. Davenport asked for more gravy, Jonah dipped the ladle with impeccable timing, making eye contact for the fraction of a second that human attention allowed. When young Master Henry's fork slipped, Jonah was there instantly, retrieving it with the same serene calm that betrayed nothing. The family, accustomed to obedience, mistook his composure for subservience. They did not see the mind behind the face. Jonah noted the hierarchy, the jealousies, the quiet resentments that passed like whispers beneath the din of conversation. He memorized who spoke first, who fumbled with words, and who depended on others to shine. The more they believed him harmless, the more information he gathered. For him, this dinner was not just a meal, it was reconnaissance. Every laugh, every snide remark, every overconfident gesture became a thread in a tapestry he was quietly weaving, a map that would later guide actions they could not anticipate. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to recent business deals. Mr. Davenport, flushed with pride from his latest cotton shipment, spoke of profits as if they were holy commandments, while his brother-in-law sneered at his modesty. Jonah poured wine with perfect precision, listening intently. He noted the anxiety in Mr. Davenport's voice when discussing debts, the way the younger children clung to their mother's skirts, and the subtle glances exchanged between the family matriarch and the housekeeper. Nothing escaped him. Every piece of information was a stone laid carefully in the construction of a future plan, one the Davenports could not possibly imagine. The young women at the table found Jonah comforting without knowing why. He was attentive, yet not intrusive. His smile, always calm and measured, seemed to carry reassurance. He never spoke unnecessarily, never drew attention to himself, and never displayed fatigue or irritation, no matter how long the meal lasted. It was a performance, yes, but it was also armor. The outer mask hid years of pain, stolen freedom, and the bitter knowledge of injustice. His body may have been property, but his mind was his own, sharper and freer than any Davenport could comprehend. Dinner progressed, and the servants moved silently in and out of the dining hall, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and maintaining a delicate balance that kept the household running. To the Davenports, this was simply the natural order, the masters at the table, the servants on the floor, the hierarchy unquestioned and unbroken. Yet in Jonah's eyes, every action of the family reinforced what he had long known. Privilege made them blind, arrogance made them vulnerable, and the underestimation of others could be exploited. By the end of the meal, the family leaned back in their chairs, sated and content. They had eaten well, laughed lightly, and felt assured of their place in the world. Jonah, his duties complete, allowed a brief moment to relax his posture, but the smile remained. It was a tool, a shield, and a weapon all in one. He did not yet move toward the evening's deeper work, but the groundwork had been laid. Every observation, every detail, every subtle interaction would feed into the plan that he had nurtured for years, patiently, quietly, invisibly. When the children were excused and the adults lingered over wine and cigars, Jonah retreated to the side of the room, attending to smaller, unnoticed tasks, straightening silverware, adjusting the tablecloth, wiping spills the family never saw. He noticed the family's habits, Mr. Davenport's tendency to misplace his glasses, the way Mrs. Davenport preferred the left-hand side of her chair, the subtle competition between the two eldest daughters for attention. These were trivialities, perhaps, to the masters, but to Jonah they were the edges of a map, clues to the vulnerabilities of those who believed themselves untouchable. As the night deepened, the servants began to retire, yet Jonah remained near the dining room, quietly cataloguing the minutiae of the household. Every movement, every word, every glance had been committed to memory. His smile never faltered, not once, as though it was stitched into his very being. To the Davenports, it was simply a pleasant presence, a loyal and unassuming man whose life was their property. To Jonah, it was a mask perfected over years, a mask that concealed far more than they could imagine. Outside, the moon rose over the sprawling estate, casting silver light across the fields and the mansion. Inside, Jonah cleaned and polished. Dee prepared and observed, and above all, smiled. The family would go to bed thinking themselves safe, thinking the night would pass as it always did, thinking that everything was under their control. But Jonah's smile was not merely a gesture of obedience, it was a quiet promise, a silent declaration that knowledge had been gathered and patience was being kept. What was to come they could not foresee, and what he had learned tonight would shape it entirely. By the time the household was quiet and the last candle guttered, Jonah retreated to the shadows of the servants' quarters. There, alone in the dim light, the mask of the polite, obedient servant was replaced by the faintest flicker of something else, determination, a spark of strategy, a plan beginning to take root. The night was long, and the family slept unaware that the calm, smiling servant they trusted implicitly was already charting a course that would alter their world by morning. The smile had served its purpose tonight. It had disarmed, concealed, and collected. The future was coming, quietly, methodically, and Jonah would be ready. The night had settled over the Davenport estate, thick and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the warm summer breeze and the faint snore of the exhausted household. In the servants' quarters, the hum of quiet labor and whispered conversations filled the air, though most of the workers were already in bed. The plantation, sprawling and imposing in its daylight grandeur, seemed almost sinister at night, its shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. And yet for Jonah, the darkness was not a threat. It was a shield, a cloak under which his thoughts moved freely, unhindered by the eyes of masters or overseers. As the other servants slept, Jonah sat alone on a worn wooden stool in the corner of the room, the dim light of a single candle flickering across. His face. To the world he was a simple man, obedient and silent, a fixture of the estate. But in these stolen moments, away from prying eyes, the truth of his mind emerged, calculating, remembering, plotting. He traced the lines of the walls, the beams above, the narrow doorways, imagining how they could be used, shifted, or avoided. Every detail of the house had been memorized, every secret path and shadow catalogued. This was not mere curiosity, it was preparation, patience honed into precision. Jonah's thoughts turned inward, as they often did in the stillness of the night. He remembered the life he had lost before the chains of slavery claimed him, the name that had once been his, spoken by a family who had loved him, his real family, ripped away before he could fully comprehend it. He recalled the small house by the river, the scent of wet earth after rain, the lullabies that had been sung under the open sky. Those memories were private treasures, carefully tucked away behind the mask of the smiling servant. In them lay a kernel of resistance, a spark of freedom that no whip, no command, no order could ever extinguish. And then there were the lessons, learned in secret and at great risk. A previous owner, a rare figure of kindness, had taught him letters and numbers, the art of reading the world as well as words. It had been forbidden, dangerous even, but Jonah had learned nonetheless, storing knowledge in the recesses of his mind. Now that knowledge was a tool, one that allowed him to see through deception, to anticipate greed, arrogance, and weakness in the very people who believed themselves untouchable. The smile he wore was the final act of theater, pleasant, unassuming, yet hiding a mind as sharp as any blade. Tonight, that mind was busy. He moved silently through the quarters, checking the small details of the household. Locks were inspected under the moo. Light, quietly tested and noted. Doors were jiggled to see which could be forced if necessary. The stables, which housed the horses essential to the estate's wealth and mobility, were examined with meticulous care. Jonah tested hinges, noted the animals' reactions to his presence, and even traced the paths of guards and overseers as they made their rounds. Every observation was catalogued, every weakness committed to memory. It was during these hours that Jonah's plans began to take shape, not with haste, but with the deliberate patience of someone who had waited years for the right moment. He thought of the family's pride, their arrogance, their belief in the infallibility of their social order. They saw themselves as masters of men and land, untouchable in their wealth, untouchable in their power. But power, Jonah knew, was fragile, especially when built upon cruelty and ignorance. Every insult he had endured, every day spent pretending, every word left unspoken fed into the larger design he now began to weave. The estate was more than a collection of buildings and fields. It was a complex organism, one that relied upon human labor, secrecy, and compliance. Jonah understood its rhythms intimately, the timing of the night watch, the placement of the lanterns, the habits of the overseers. All of it was data, waiting for application. He planned not merely to disrupt, but to unbalance, to unravel the confidence of the Davenports in subtle, nearly invisible ways. A mislaid key, a door left ajar, a horse unsettled. These small acts would accumulate, like threads in a tapestry, until the house could no longer sustain its facade of order. Yet Jonah's cunning was not driven by cruelty alone. It was a response to injustice, a reclamation of dignity stolen from him and countless others. In the quiet of the night, he imagined the consequences of discovery. He did not fear them. Not in the way the masters would, with panic and indignation. He understood risk, weighed it, and prepared for it. Every action he might take had contingencies, every path had escape routes. The smile he wore during the day concealed not weakness, but a mind that was always 3 steps ahead, a mind that had learned the art of invisibility in a world that demanded submission. As he moved from room to room, Jonah reflected on the people around him, both enslaved and free. He knew which workers could be trusted, which would falter under pressure, which might seize opportunity if it arose. There was subtle leadership in his approach, guidance offered through quiet words, gestures, and the occasional shared glance. He was careful not to inspire suspicion, yet he sowed small seeds of awareness in those who might one day act alongside him. The smile he wore during the day, which seemed benign and subservient, now extended in the form of subtle influence, guiding others without drawing attention to himself. Jonah paused in the kitchen, where the remnants of dinner lingered. The room smelled faintly of roasted meat, herbs, and wax. Here, too, he observed, Knives and utensils were accounted for, carefully returned to their places, yet notes were made in his mind, which could be used, which might hinder, which might create small delays or confusion when the time came. Even the smallest details were not overlooked, for he had learned that the greatest victories often come from the accumulation of minor advantages. He thought of the master and mistress, of the children and their petty rivalries, and of the household staff, many of whom were oblivious to the potential for disruption that existed within the very walls they tended. The Davenports believed in hierarchy, in obedience, in control, but they did not understand that control is an illusion maintained only by fear and ignorance. Jonah had lived both sides of that reality and had learned to exploit the cracks in the veneer. His smile was the key, his patience the lockpick, and his knowledge the map. Hours passed. The moon traveled across the sky, and the estate remained still. Jonah finally returned to the servants' quarters, his movements deliberate, each step measured. He paused at the doorway, listening to the soft breathing of his fellow workers, many of whom were now asleep, trusting in the quiet of the night. In this moment of solitude, Jonah allowed himself a brief reflection. The smile he wore, perfected over years, had allowed him to observe, to gather, to understand, and now to plan. It had become more than a mask. It was a strategy, a weapon of the mind. He retrieved a small bundle of papers, hidden beneath the floorboards, remnants of lessons learned long ago. Maps, notes, and calculations, all quietly accumulated, all meticulously organized. These papers were a connection to a past life, a reminder that his intellect and spirit could not be enslaved even if his body was. He studied them under the faint candlelight, tracing routes through the estate, noting weak points and imagining the sequence of events that could unsettle the household without immediate detection. The night offered him freedom of thought in a world where freedom was otherwise forbidden. As the candle flickered low, Jonah contemplated the day to come. He would return to the dining hall in the morning, smiling, calm, and obedient. The Davenports would continue to underestimate him, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath their feet. His mind, sharp and unyielding, would guide every action, every reaction, every moment until the carefully constructed plans began to unfold. The smile, ever present, would remain unchanged. An illusion, a mask, a warning hidden in plain sight. Finally, Jonah allowed himself to rest. Curling on the simple bedding of the servants' quarters, sleep would come in fragments, uneasy and interrupted, but it was enough. Even in slumber, his mind continued to weave possibilities, imagine contingencies, and rehearse the unfolding of events. The plantation, the family, the hierarchy, all were pieces in a larger game that Jonah had been forced to play since childhood, now coming to its calculated climax. In the quiet, Jonah's resolve hardened. The smile he carried, the obedience he feigned, and the patience he cultivated were all instruments of a plan, long in preparation. By morning, nothing would be the same. The household that had looked upon him with casual dismissal would awaken to a reality they could not control, could not predict, and could not contain. And through it all, Jonah's presence would remain, serene and smiling, a reminder that knowledge and patience are sometimes more powerful than chains, more powerful than fear, more powerful than cruelty. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to brush the sky with pale light, signaling the end of the long, deliberate night. Jonah rose from his simple bed, stretching his body carefully, testing the stiffness of muscles honed through years of labor and vigilance. The household would soon stir, the rituals of wealth and order would resume, and he would return to the dining hall with the same calm demeanor, the same reassuring smile, and the same concealed purpose. But in his mind, the gears had already begun to turn, setting into motion the series of events that would shake the foundations of the Davenport estate, piece by piece, until nothing remained untouched. Jonah paused at the doorway, casting one last glance at the dimly lit room. The candle had burned low, the papers lay ready, and the quiet of the night had been a canvas for his preparation. His lips curved slightly, not in fatigue or amusement, but in resolve. The day ahead would be long, delicate, and fraught with potential peril, but he was ready. The world would continue to see only the smiling servant, unaware that within him lay the mind of a strategist, the heart of one who had been wronged, and the patience of one who understood that true power often comes not from force, but from subtlety, cunning, and the long game. And so, as the first light of dawn crept across the plantation, Jonah stepped quietly into the day, his smile in place, his eyes alert, and his purpose clear. The family would never see it coming, but by nightfall, the balance of power would shift in ways they could not imagine. The smile had hidden more than obedience. It had concealed knowledge, intent, and the quiet, unstoppable force of a man who would not be broken. The sun had long dipped beneath the horizon, and the Davenport estate was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim glow of lanterns that flickered along the main walkways. The air was heavy with the scent of summer, hot earth, cotton leaves, and the faint odor of tallow from candles burning in the windows. The household, confident in the order and control they believed they possessed, had settled into its evening routines. Little did they know, the careful balance of power was about to be disrupted, and the obedient servant who smiled so serenely during the day was poised to become the architect of chaos. Jonah moved through the shadows of the plantation like a spectre. Years of observation had prepared him for this night, a night that had been meticulously planned in his mind, nurtured with patience and silent calculation. Every step, every movement, every small act had been rehearsed, and the timing had been chosen with precision. The world saw only the smiling, obedient servant, yet beneath that placid exterior lay the mind of a strategist and the heart of a Ma. Who had long endured injustice. The first target of his subtle assault was the stables. Horses, the lifeblood of the plantation's wealth and mobility, were restless tonight. Jonah moved among them, opening stall doors just slightly, enough for them to nudge and paw at the ground in agitation. He whispered to them softly, his voice carrying a rhythm they understood. The animals responded to him, not with fear, but with a controlled unease, enough to unsettle the household later. This small act, seemingly harmless, would ripple outward. A horse startled during the night could overturn a carriage, break a fence, or alarm a guard, creating confusion in the earliest hours before dawn. Next, he checked the locks of the doors and windows. Each latch, each bolt, each chain had been noted in his mind, yet he inspected them physically, adjusting where a small shift could be made. A loosened lock here, a door left slightly ajar there. These were his tools, invisible to the unsuspecting eye but deadly in their subtlety. To the Davenports, everything appeared normal, perfect even, but the illusion of security was exactly what Jonah sought to exploit. Moving quietly, Jonah entered the main kitchen. He inspected the firewood, noting which pieces were dry and ready to ignite. Though no one suspected it, a small spark in the right place could create panic without threatening lives. He arranged the pieces with care, ensuring that if a flame appeared, it would spread just enough to demand attention, to draw people away from their routines, but not so much as to destroy the estate entirely on a whim. Chaos had to be controlled, precise and purposeful. He paused at the dining room, recalling every movement from the previous night. Chairs, silverware, glasses, and serving trays, all were in place. The meticulous arrangement of the room, so central to the Davenport's pride, would soon become another instrument in his orchestration. A misaligned chair, a subtly misplaced glass, a candle slightly tilted. These were not accidents, but seeds of unease, subtle disruptions that would gradually fray the edges of the household confidence. Jonah's steps led him to the upper floors where the family slept, unaware of the storm that was approaching. He moved past the sleeping children, past the master and mistress, careful not to disturb a single breath. Every detail had been memorized: who slept where, who was a light sleeper, who snored, who might awaken easily to noise. This knowledge allowed him to plan each step with precision, ensuring maximum disruption with minimal exposure. He was not reckless, he was deliberate. Outside, the moon rose higher, casting pale silver light across the fields. Jonah paused, looking out over the cotton rows that swayed gently in the night breeze. In the distance, the estate's fences and gates glimmered faintly. The world was silent, but it was a deceptive silence. Tonight, that calm was fragile, and Jonah's actions would test its limits. He moved toward the perimeter of the property, ensuring that key gates were left unsecured. Any traveler or guard arriving would be delayed or misdirected. The estate, which had seemed invincible in daylight, was becoming a labyrinth of opportunity in his hands. Returning inside, Jonah began to interact with the other enslaved workers who had remained awake, guiding them with subtle gestures and whispered instructions. They understood the stakes, though only partially. They moved quietly, reinforcing doors, positioning objects, and creating minor obstacles designed to confuse the masters. These acts were not rebellion in the open. They were strategic, measured, and intentional. The household's own structures would betray it, and no one would suspect the smiling servant who had been present. Tea at every meal, polite and composed, every day. As the night deepened, Jonah focused on the kitchen again. He lit a small, controlled flame near the firewood stack, ensuring it would spread slowly. It was enough to create smoke, enough to demand attention, but he was careful not to endanger lives. The plan required precision, chaos without unnecessary loss, fear without fatality. A distant fire, the smell of smoke, the soft crackle of burning wood would rouse the household in stages, drawing them into confusion and anxiety. In the hallways, Jonah quietly adjusted objects to maximize disruption. A chair slightly tipped over in a corridor, a tray placed in the wrong room, a key removed from a hook. All would seem insignificant in isolation, but together they would erode the family's sense of control. Even the placement of lanterns was carefully considered, creating shadows and misleading angles that would make the familiar seem strange, uncomfortable, and threatening. The household began to stir, a faint wail from a child awakened by the smell of smoke, a rustle in the stables as horses reacted to their slightly loosened stalls, footsteps of confused servants rushing to investigate. Jonah's plan was entering its first stage. He moved silently among them, directing their attention subtly, ensuring they acted in ways that furthered the confusion. To the Davenports, the night seemed like a series of unfortunate events, random and unconnected. To Jonah, it was a carefully choreographed symphony of disruption. He paused at the top of the staircase, observing the master's reaction. Mr. Davenport, roused from sleep, frowned at the faint odor of smoke. He muttered commands to the servants, his voice thick with irritation and authority, yet ineffective. The household was beginning to fracture under its own weight, its confidence shaken by events that seemed inexplicable. Jonah H's smile remained unchanged, calm, serene, almost invisible, yet every movement he had made that night had guided the events unfolding below. The fire in the kitchen spread just enough to fill the room with smoke, but Jonah had ensured it remained manageable. It would require intervention, drawing people away from the bedrooms and offices, creating space for further mischief. Panic, however mild, was a weapon he wielded expertly. As servants rushed to contain the smoke, they were guided subtly by his gestures, moving furniture and objects in ways that added to the confusion rather than reducing it. Every decision they made was influenced without their awareness, every reaction predictable and anticipated. Jonah's mind returned briefly to the family's hubris. They had spent decades believing their power absolute, their control complete. They had relied on fear, authority, and appearances to maintain order, never understanding that a single, patient individual with knowledge and cunning could undermine the foundation of their world. He remembered the insults, the casual dismissals, the assumptions of obedience. All of it had led to this night, a night in which the illusion of control would shatter quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. In the stables, the chaos intensified. Horses, already unsettled, began to rear and neigh. Their agitation spilled outward, reaching the main house. Guards, arriving too late to anticipate the disturbance, struggled to maintain order. Every element of the estate, the building, the animals, the servants, the routines, was now subtly destabilized, all under the direction of the one who smiled politely at the dining table each day. Jonah moved among the panicked staff, offering quiet instructions, nudges, and gestures. He remained calm, a beacon of serenity amid the growing turmoil. To the Davenports, he seemed merely dutiful, a man whose company composure remained intact despite the night's strange events. They could not know that the very person they trusted most, the smiling servant, was orchestrating the fractures they now experienced. Each misstep, each delay, each moment of uncertainty was part of the plan, carefully executed with precision. The night reached its climax as smoke began to fill the corridors, alarms raised by the household's misinterpretation of events. The master and mistress, flustered and confused, attempted to restore order, but their authority faltered under the subtle and pervasive chaos. The carefully maintained hierarchy, so rigid in daylight, was crumbling under a night of quiet fire, both literal and metaphorical. Jonah observed from the shadows, his smile unwavering, his mind calculating the next steps. He knew the importance of timing. The chaos had to peak just as dawn approached, so that the household would awaken to the consequences of a night that had been orchestrated from the shadows. The misaligned doors, unsettled horses, smoke and confusion were not random. They were deliberate disruptions, a test of the family's resilience and perception. Each small act had accumulated into a larger pattern, one that would be unmistakable in its impact by morning. Finally, Jonah returned to the servants' quarters, moving quietly, ensuring that his presence remained unseen. The household continued to grapple with the subtle disruptions, unaware that the smiling servant, who had guided their meals, poured their wine, and polished their silverware, was also guiding the chaos that now enveloped them. He allowed himself a brief moment to observe, to ensure the plan was proceeding as intended. Every reaction, every hesitation, every misplaced step was accounted for. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon. The estate, sprawling and imposing, was now in disarray, its sense of order shattered by subtle, deliberate actions that left no trace of the hand that guided them. Jonah stepped quietly into the cool morning air, breathing deeply. The night's work had been successful. The household, confident in its power and control, had been unsettled, disoriented, and unbalanced. And in the quiet aftermath, the smiling servant remained serene and calm, a figure of apparent obedience and loyalty. By the time the family fully emerged from their disrupted sleep, the consequences of Jonah's night-long orchestration were clear. Panic had given way to confusion, frustration, and fear. Horses had escaped, doors had been left unsecured, smoke lingered faintly in the hallways, and the hierarchy of authority had been subtly, irrevocably undermined. The Davenports were left to wonder how so many small misfortunes could have aligned so perfectly in a single night. They could not conceive that the answer had been sitting among them all along, smiling politely, attending to their needs, and observing their reactions with unshakable patience. Jonah returned to the dining hall, once again resuming the role he had mastered, the obedient, smiling servant. His demeanor betrayed nothing. The family, preoccupied with the lingering chaos, accepted his calm presence as a natural part of the household order. They saw only the mask of loyalty and subservience, unaware that behind it lay a mind that had orchestrated the events that would leave the estate altered forever. The night's quiet fire had tested the family, exposed vulnerabilities, and revealed the fragility of their assumed control. Jonah had proven, in the most subtle and devastating way, that knowledge, patience, and cunning could outmatch brute power and unquestioned authority. As the sun rose fully over the estate, the Davenports faced a new day, one that bore the subtle scars of the night's disturbances. The household would never be the same, and Jonah, ever calm, ever smiling, prepared for the next stage of his work, knowing that the foundation he had begun to destabilize would soon crumble completely, leaving the family to confront the consequences of their ignorance and hubris. The smile, as always, remained intact, masking the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed and the unyielding determination of a man who had endured injustice and was finally beginning to reclaim his own power. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, washing the Davenport estate in a pale, fragile glow. Where once the grounds had seemed pristine, disciplined, and orderly, now the subtle scars of the previous night's events were painfully visible. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of scorched wood lingering faintly in the hallways. Horses neighed uneasily in the stables, still unsettled from the carefully orchestrated disruptions that had roused them hours before. Doors were ajar where they should have been locked, chairs lay misaligned in corridors, and servants moved nervously, whispering to one another in confusion. To the Davenports, it was a nightmare wrapped in mystery. No one had seen the cause, no one had understood how so many small, seemingly insignificant incidents could converge into such chaos. They blamed negligence, bad luck, the whim of fate, but never the smiling, calm servant who had moved among them every day, offering polite attentions, refilling glasses and tending to the house with unflinching obedience. To them, Jonah had remained the perfect servant. Yet in truth, he had been the architect of this upheaval, the quiet hand that had destabilized their world without a single overt act of violence. Jonah emerged from the servants' quarters just as the household began to stir fully. His movements were deliberate, calm, unremarkable. He polished silver, earware, arranged linens, and quietly carried water to the kitchens. His smile, as always, was serene, polite, and reassuring. The Davenports, frazzled and distracted by the night's events, barely registered his presence. To them, he was the same man who had served them with grace and civility for years. They could not see the mind behind the smile, the years of careful observation and planning that had culminated in the night's quiet revolution. In the dining hall, the family assembled for breakfast, their faces drawn with worry and irritation. The master, Mr. Davenport, barked commands to servants who struggled to account for every disruption. The mistress, still pale from the smoke that had seeped into the upper floors, fussed over misplaced dishes and missing utensils. Even the children, normally carefree, sensed the tension in the air, their eyes wide and uncertain. Every element of the household seemed off balance, as though the invisible threads that held it together had been severed while they slept. Jonah moved among them, attentive and composed, performing his duties with precision. He poured coffee, passed bread, and offered polite words where appropriate. To the family, he was a stabilizing presence, a reminder of the normalcy they desperately sought. But behind his calm exterior, he observed everything: the lines of worry etched into Mr. Davenport's forehead, the subtle tremor in the mistress's hand as she handled her teacup, the whispered questions the children exchanged in confusion. Each observation reinforced the careful work of the night, confirming that the first stage of his plan had succeeded. Outside the mansion, the aftermath of the disruptions was just as deliberate. Horses, still unsettled, had caused minor damage to fences and gates, and several gates hung loosely on their hinges. These outward signs of disorder were carefully designed to magnify the family's anxiety and sense of vulnerability. Jonah had understood long ago that true power did not come from force alone. It came from perception. By manipulating what the family could see, hear, and feel, he had sown seeds of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, and by morning the house itself seemed to be conspiring against them. The estate's servants moved cautiously, uncertain of what to do. Some whispered about ghosts, misfortune, or divine punishment. Some blamed each other, while others simply froze, unsure how to proceed in the absence of clear authority. Jonah, as always, remained calm, directing them subtly with a gesture or a quiet word. He did not raise his voice. He did not call attention to himself. Yet with every nudge and suggestion, he guided their actions, ensuring that the chaos continued to unfold in exactly the manner he had envisioned. As the morning progressed, the Davenports attempted to restore order. Mr. Davenport inspected the stables, finding the gates unsecured and the horses anxious. The mistress surveyed the house, cataloguing the minor damages, the misplaced furniture, and the faint smoke that lingered in the hallways. They struggled to account for every disruption, but the pattern eluded them. No single event could explain the cumulative effect of the night's orchestration. It was as though the house itself had risen against them, subtle and relentless in its revolt. Meanwhile, Jonah moved among the guests and servants alike, observing and calculating. He noted the reactions of those who had witnessed the night's events, cataloguing fear, confusion, and misinterpretation. Even the most composed members of the household were now uncertain of their environment, and that uncertainty was the tool Jonah had been refining for years. His smile never wavered, for it was not merely a mask, it was a symbol of control, patience, and unobserve. Mastery. By mid-morning, the estate was a reflection of the night's quiet upheaval. The household had begun to whisper among themselves, questioning one another, questioning reality, and questioning their own judgment. The veneer of authority had been undermined, and the Davenports felt the first real tremor of vulnerability they had ever known. They would never admit it, but in the depth of their minds, they recognized that the unseen hand guiding events was far more capable than any of their assumptions had allowed. Jonah, observing from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction. The plan had unfolded with precision. There had been no overt confrontation, no unnecessary violence, yet the impact was undeniable. The household had been destabilized, their sense of order fractured, and their arrogance challenged in a way they could not immediately comprehend. The smiling servant, the obedient man of countless dinners and polite attentions, had proven that patience, intelligence, and subtlety could accomplish what brute force never could. In the hours that followed, rumors began to circulate throughout the estate and the surrounding lands. Whispers of the fire, strange noises, and misplaced items reached neighboring plantations. Some speculated about thieves, others about supernatural forces. No one suspected Jonah, whose calm demeanor and apparent loyalty were now beyond question. The beauty of his plan lay in its invisibility. The person responsible was invisible precisely because no one had ever questioned the smiling servant. He had become a ghost in plain sight, a presence whose influence was undeniable, yet imperceptible. Jonah's mind, however, was already moving beyond the morning. The first stage of disruption was complete, but the consequences were only beginning. He had demonstrated the fragility of the household, revealed the vulnerability of the family, and created an environment ripe for further change. Every observation made during the chaos would inform his next actions. Every fear, every misstep, every panic-stricken reaction was data to be catalogued and utilized. The night's work was not merely an act of revenge, it was the beginning of a reclamation of dignity, knowledge, and agency. The family, meanwhile, was left to piece together the puzzle of the previous night. The master's pride had been bruised, the mistress's composure shaken, and the children's innocence disrupted. Every attempt to explain or rationalize the events failed. The estate, which had once been a symbol of control and power, now stood as a testament to the unpredictable consequences of underestimating those who served quietly, with patience and intelligence. The Davenports had glimpsed, however fleetingly, the limitations of their authority and the vulnerabilities they had ignored for so long. Jonah moved through the estate one final time that morning, checking the results of his efforts. The stables, the hallways, the doors, and the servants' routines had all been subtly altered, creating a lasting impression of instability. His presence remained calm and reassuring to those around him, yet his mind was sharp, already calculating future steps. He had revealed to the household the power of observation, intelligence, and patience, and he had done so without confrontation, without violence, and without detection. The legacy of the night would linger far longer than the smoke that still faintly clung to the walls. By noon, the household had returned cautiously to its daily routines, but the changes were permanent. The Davenports moved with a new wariness, their arrogance tempered by an invisible hand they could neither see nor understand. The servants, emboldened by the subtle leadership of Jonah, carried themselves with a quiet confidence, aware that the world was not as immutable as the family had always claimed. And Jonah, smiling calmly as he moved among them, remained the same obedient servant to the casual eye. But to anyone paying close attention, he was a force reshaping the world in silence. It was in this way that Jonah left the estate that afternoon, moving quietly through the fields, slipping past the fences and gates that had been subtly weakened during the night's events. No one noticed his departure, no one questioned it. The household continued in its fragile state of order, unaware that the man they had trusted most had vanished without a trace. Jonah stepped into the wider world, free at last, carrying with him the knowledge, patience, and dignity that had been denied for so long. The legend of the smiling servant, who had served dinner with perfection and orchestrated chaos by morning, would linger in whispers and rumor for decades to come. And so the story ends with the quiet triumph of intelligence over arrogance, patience over oppression, and subtlety over brute force. Jonah's actions remind us that the most profound power often lies hidden, unseen by those who assume control, and that even in the harshest circumstances, dignity, strategy, and patience can create lasting change. If you enjoyed this story and the legend of Jonah, the servant who outsmarted the powerful and reclaimed his freedom, make sure to like this video, comment below your thoughts, and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to US Aburied Stories for more incredible tales from history, forgotten legends, and stories that time tried to bury. Your support helps us bring these hidden stories to life, and we have many more coming your way. Remember, every smile may hide a story, and every quiet moment may conceal extraordinary courage.